January 1945, Camp Fort Getty, Rhode Island. Snow pressed softly against the wooden barracks as the Atlantic wind carried the smell of salt and cold pine through the wire fences. Inside a long, unheated building once meant for drills, rows of shelves stood quietly beneath dim lights. Hardbound volumes, paperbacks, textbooks, and newspapers rested in orderly lines. A German prisoner of war stepped inside, removed his gloves, and ran his fingers along the spines. The silence was broken only by the turning of pages. Beyond the barbed wire, the wars still raged, but here, something unexpected existed: a library. For many German POWs captured in North Africa, Italy, and later France, arrival in the United States brought not relief but suspicion. Years of ideological conditioning had taught them to expect humiliation, deprivation, and forced labor. Nazi propaganda had portrayed American society as culturally shallow, racially divided, and intellectually bankrupt. The idea that prisoners, enemy soldiers, would be allowed free access to books seemed not merely unlikely but impossible. Yet by 1944, the United States held over 400,000 German prisoners across more than 500 camps. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, captor nations were required to provide humane treatment, including intellectual and recreational opportunities. American authorities went further. The War Department, in coordination with the YMCA and the Red Cross, established formal camp libraries stocked with thousands of titles. These collections included German-language literature, philosophy, science, history, mathematics, engineering manuals, and even banned works that many prisoners had never been permitted to read at home. The symbolic object of this story, the book, soon took on a meaning far beyond paper and ink. It became a quiet challenge to everything these men had been taught to believe.
German officers expected captivity to mean mental stagnation. In their own system, POWs were often denied education, fearing ideological contamination. Knowledge was controlled, rationed, weaponized. In contrast, American camps encouraged learning. According to official U.S. Army records, by late 1944, more than 25,000 German POWs were enrolled in camp education programs. Libraries circulated millions of books annually. At Camp Algona in Iowa, prisoners organized reading groups. At Camp Fort Benning, Georgia, German engineers studied American technical manuals. At Camp Papago Park, Arizona, philosophy texts passed hand to hand. The emotional contrast was stark. These were men raised in a system where books had been burned in public squares, where entire categories of thought were forbidden. Now, under guard towers flying enemy flags, they could read Goethe, Kant, Thomas Mann, Shakespeare, and even translations of American constitutional texts. No interrogator stood nearby. No ideological officer monitored their choices. The book could be opened or closed by the prisoner alone. Many German POWs recorded their astonishment in diaries and letters, later archived in post-war oral histories. One former Luftwaffe officer recalled that the first unrestricted library he ever entered was not in Germany, but in an American prison camp. Another admitted that reading foreign newspapers forced him to confront how insulated his worldview had been. Statistical records confirm that camp libraries were among the most heavily used facilities, often surpassing sports or theater attendance during winter months. This access was not accidental. American planners understood that the war would not end with surrender alone. They believed that exposure to democratic norms, free inquiry, personal choice, intellectual dignity could quietly undermine authoritarian ideology. Unlike formal re-education programs later used in occupied Germany, the libraries operated without coercion. No lectures, no slogans, only shelves and silence. The transformation unfolded slowly. At first, many prisoners approached the books defensively, selecting technical manuals or familiar classics. Over time, curiosity widened. Works previously labeled degenerate under Nazi law circulated freely. Jewish authors were read without comment. Political theory texts were debated in barracks. The book became a mirror, reflecting contradictions the regime had never allowed them to see. For some prisoners, this intellectual freedom was more unsettling than captivity itself. Captivity had stripped them of weapons and uniforms, but the library stripped them of certainty. The realization emerged gradually. The enemy trusted them with ideas. That trust carried weight. American guards often observed that discipline problems declined in camps with active libraries. Education created structure. Thought created distance from fanaticism. By 1945, intelligence reports noted a measurable ideological softening among long-term POWs exposed to sustained educational programs. While not universal, the shift was real enough that U.S. authorities expanded book shipments rather than restricting them. The symbolism of the book deepened. In Nazi Germany, books had been symbols of loyalty or treason, permitted or forbidden by the state. In American camps, they symbolized choice. A prisoner could read or not read, agree or disagree, learn or ignore. That freedom, small, quiet, personal, stood in direct opposition to totalitarian control. As the war ended and prisoners prepared for repatriation, many requested permission to bring books home. Records show that thousands of volumes left the camps legally, carried back to a country in ruins. Some former POWs later became teachers, engineers, and civil servants in post-war West Germany. In interviews decades later, several credited their first encounter with unrestricted learning to those American camp libraries. The war had taught them how systems destroy. The books showed them how societies rebuild. The epilogue of this story is not loud. It does not involve explosions or surrender ceremonies. It exists in the quiet image of a prisoner seated at a wooden table, barbed wire visible through a frosted window, turning pages freely for the first time. The book did not end the war, but it planted something durable. In the long struggle between ideologies, weapons decide battles, but ideas shape futures. The American decision to place libraries inside prison camps revealed a deeper confidence that democracy does not fear knowledge, even in the hands of its enemies. And for many German prisoners, that realization outlasted captivity. When they returned home, they carried more than memories of defeat. They carried the understanding that freedom can exist even behind fences, that abundance can be quiet, and that the most powerful challenge to tyranny is not force alone, but the simple, radical act of letting a man read.